Margaret Sanger, who began Planned Parenthood, once said, "I look forward to seeing humanity free someday of the tyranny of Christianity."
We so often hear this view of Christianity. Have Christ and Christianity brought tyranny to the world, or have they been the world's greatest force in freeing us from tyranny?
Before Christ was born, the world was a very dangerous place to live. Unwanted babies were routinely thrown away. Human beings were killed for sport.
Jesus was born, of course, into the ancient world, which had a tradition of a rather low appreciation of human life, as witness all the wars that took place, as witness the butchery of the Roman gladiatorial combat, where self-respecting Romans never mind seeing people dirked to death or gigged to death or hung on crosses or burned or whatever else. This was part of the brutish character of the times.
As you know, in the ancient world, hundreds, if not in Rome, thousands of babies, newly born, were exposed every morning on the rubbish dumps, mainly women.
But the Christians ultimately ended infanticide, and they ended the gladiatorial contests as well. After all, they tried to follow the footsteps of their master, who was the first to proclaim to the world the golden rule.
In everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets.
Furthermore, Jesus Christ increased the value of human life by elevating the value of women. Mistreatment of women was common throughout the ancient world. One of the worst examples of this took place in the nation of India, where women were subject to the horrific practice of widow burning, or sati.
It's called sati when a husband died, and very often these would be 10, 11, 12-year-old girls married to 40 or 50-year-old men. He's dead, then his widow would be asked to die with him, burn on his funeral pyre.
The custom of sati had a long history in India. It was practiced widely throughout the country for thousands of years, until the agitation of Christian missionaries finally made it illegal in the 1830s. Thousands of Indian women, even now, owe their very lives to Christ's influence in abolishing sati. Though radical feminists are loath to admit it, it has been Christianity which has affirmed the inherent value and dignity of women worldwide.
One of the more interesting things about American culture today is the radical feminist idea that women have been victims of Christianity. Nothing could be farther from the truth.
Dr. Janice Shaw Krause is a senior fellow at the Beverly LaHaye Institute in Washington, D.C.
The Bible has been the most effective force in history for lifting women to higher levels of respect, dignity, and freedom. And our Christianity has made us victors, not victims by any means.
Furthermore, in many parts of the world, Christianity ended polygamy, a practice inherently unfair to women.
Clearly, the Christian faith is the primary instrument for the reform and removal of some of the most egregious violations of humanness in history.
For example, by the year 1900, it was Christianity that put an end to cannibalism, a practice found in various parts of the globe.
An example of Christ transforming a life and even a culture involves a U.S. serviceman during World War II who was out at a remote Pacific island. And he saw this islander who was carrying a big Bible. And he said to the native, "Where I come from, we don't believe in that book anymore." And the islander grinned right back at him and he said, "Well, it's a good thing for you that we do. Otherwise, you would be in here by now." And he patted his stomach. Former cannibals.
One of the blights on world history is the practice of slavery. Critics point out that some Christians owned slaves and condoned the peculiar institution. But the countercharge is that slavery was ended by the active interference of Christians.
It was the Christian church more than any other agency that was responsible for the emancipation of the slaves. It was William Wilberforce in the 1830s in the British Empire, a dedicated Christian who on the basis of his Christianity worked so desperately to get slaves freed through the British Parliament.
William Wilberforce was a long-standing member of Parliament who gathered around him a group of like-minded men who fought the slave trade. First, to prevent more slaves from being captured in Africa and brought over to British territory. That took about 25 years.
There should not be a slave trade. People should not be misused, mistreated.
Secondly, they also fought to free all the slaves in the British Empire. Even unbelieving scholars acknowledge the link between Christianity and the abolition of slavery, such as Robin Lane Fox, an atheist and fellow at Oxford.
Well, I think for the real impact of Christianity on the history of slavery, you have to look to the 18th and 19th centuries, to England, and then, interestingly, later to America, for the impact particularly of evangelical teachings in England. That is enormously important.
When Wilberforce was on his deathbed, he received the good news that his lifelong crusade had succeeded and that all the slaves throughout the British Empire were to be freed.
And then we also in our country, on the basis of Christian principles, Abraham Lincoln and others were able to do the same thing.
For example, the Underground Railroad was run by Quakers and other devout Christians. In 1835, 2/3 of the members of the Abolition Society were ministers of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
If you pick up credible history, you'll find that some of the little small denominations today played great role in fighting against slavery. If Jesus had not come, the slave, people who were in slavery and my foreparents, would not have heard the good news of freedom, nor would have man known that God was against slavery.
The notion that every human being is important comes from Jesus. I'm not saying that Christians have always lived this out, unfortunately, but I'm saying these things come from Jesus. He haunts everyone who cares about humanity and world history.
I fear for life in America if, heaven forbid, we ever find ourselves in a post-Christian society, because what will come in its place is not a benign neutrality, but a very sinister form of secularism. And it's one in which life will have diminished value.
What if Jesus had never been born? I don't think I'd want to live in that world.
Virtually no value was placed on human life before the arrival of Jesus Christ, except among the Jews. And even now, in those areas where Christianity is largely absent, so too is respect for human life. One only need look at the record of godless regimes in the past century to see this. The Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin, China under Mao, Cuba under Castro, Cambodia under Pol Pot. The list goes on and on. The 20th century atheistic, totalitarian regimes have proven to be the greatest killers of all time. More than 135 million people were killed by them. Human life gets its true value when human beings recognize that which was revealed in the beginning, that we were created in the image of God.
You know, a new time had come with Jesus when the way that people would think about kings and children, women and men, the rich and the poor, the greatest and the least, all began to shift. This involved an idea that had mostly been confined to a little country called Israel, but which was waiting for the right time to emerge into the wider world. What's very interesting about the people of Israel is that they worshiped one God who was good and caring and loving, while other ancient Eastern cultures had a God for almost everything, but with no concept of these gods as actually caring for them as people. All folks in the ancient world had gods. Their gods had different names, but what they shared was a hierarchical way of ordering life. At the top of creation were the gods, under them were the king. Under the king were members of the court, the priests who reported to the king. Below them were artisans, merchants, craftspeople, and then under them was a large group of peasants and slaves, and they were kind of the dregs of humanity. Now the king was regarded as divine or semi-divine. Religion was essentially connected to the state. The king was understood to be made in the image of the God who made that king. And only the king was made in the image of that God. This was a big dividing line between the king and the rest of the human race. Peasants, slaves were not made in the image of that God. They were thought to be created by inferior gods. And this is what might be called the dignity gap. The farther you were down the ladder, the wider that dignity gap. But that gap was going to be challenged by an idea that had been kind of safeguarded by Israel for centuries, the idea that there is only one God and He is incredibly good, and every human being has been made in the image of that God. This is an explosive notion about humanity and dignity, and Jesus was heir to this idea. Jesus lived it and taught it in a way that had never been seen before. When Jesus looked at people, He saw the image of God. He saw this in everybody, and that's what caused Him to teach and treat each person with such dignity. Now imagine what it did to the hearts of people who had been thought of as the dregs of humanity to be told that not just the king, but they too were created in the image of the one great God. Male and female, slaves and peasants, all made in God's image. The reason every person has great worth for Jesus is that every person is loved by this God. Each person has what might be called bestowed worth. I'll give you a little picture of this. When one of our daughters was tiny, she had one doll she loved above all others, a doll that actually initially belonged to her sister. She loved that doll so much, she commandeered her on the basis of eminent domain, and we had to buy her sister a second one. She called that doll Baby Tweezers. That doll got loved so much that her dress fell apart, and all she had was her little plastic head and limbs and squishy, soft inner body. She was then renamed Naked Baby Tweezers. She was not loved for her beauty. She set a new standard for ugly. She was loved because, just because. It's a funny thing. We could never throw out Baby Tweezers. Our daughter loved Baby Tweezers, and we loved our daughter. Baby Tweezers had bestowed worth. Now, we all know about this kind of love. You get a pet, you live in a house for 20 years, raise your kids there, you come to love it, not because it's more excellent than other houses, just because. A writer named George MacDonald loved to write about princesses and princes. And somebody asked him why one time, and he said, it's because every girl is a princess. When the questioner got confused, MacDonald asked what a princess is. It's the daughter of a king, he was told. Very well then, every little girl is a princess. Every human being is the child of a king. This is an explosive idea. The ancient world did not believe this. Ordinary children did not share the king's image. They were not thought to be created by the same God, so they grew up in a different world. Or maybe they didn't grow up at all. In the ancient world, unwanted children were often simply left to die, a practice called exposure. The head of the household had the legal right to decide the life or death of other family members. This decision was usually made during the first 8 days of life. But in the Bible, we read about a totally different view of children. In fact, one day Jesus posed the question, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Called a little child, had him stand among them, and he said, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles themselves becomes like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. A kingdom for children before Walt Disney. And the little children came. Now, as the movement Jesus started spread, among other things, it created an alternative community for children. Early instructions among his followers, such as instructions called the Didache, the teachings, in the 2nd century, prohibit the widespread practices of abortion, exposure, infanticide. By the late 4th century, a Christian emperor outlawed the practice of exposure for the entire Roman Empire. over time, instead of leaving unwanted babies on a dunghill, people began to leave them outside a monastic community or a church. And this was the beginning of what would eventually be known as orphanages. This is where they got started. Those who live in a culture truly touched and changed by this Jesus movement view individuals differently because of Jesus, whatever folks may think about Jesus. The ordinary and the lowly were given great dignity. This idea spread that all children ought to live, that all human beings are created equal. While Jesus viewed people with great dignity, one of the underlying values that Jesus modeled was the worth that God had placed in human life. We tend to be obsessed with worth. We want to know the worth of everything. If you want to know the worth of a car, you can find it in a source called the Blue Book, because if you really want that car and you find out how much it costs, you will feel blue. Jesus talks about the value of human beings quite a lot. He says, suppose one of you has only one sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? Or he'd say, look at the birds of the air. They don't sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Are not sparrows sold 2 for a penny? But your Father knows when any of them falls to the ground, and even the very hairs of your head are numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. God values sparrows. He feeds them, gives them trees, twigs for nests, little girl sparrows to mate with. God cares about them so much that He has a running inventory of them. Now, how about you? The hairs on your head are all numbered. Think about this for a moment. When you care about somebody, you notice details. When a baby is born, what do parents do when they look at their fingers and toes for the first time? They count them. And for years afterwards, every time that kid comes home, if they're missing one of those 10 fingers or toes, parents notice. Even mediocre parents do this. Jesus is saying, God doesn't just number your fingers and toes. God loves you so much, He actually numbers the hairs on your head. He notices their quantity. He mourns when they go away. He even notices their color. Proverbs 16:31 says, gray hair is a crown of splendor. It is attained by a righteous life. When you see a person with gray hair, stop in wonder and admiration because you're looking at a spiritual giant. It's in the Bible, I'm just saying. See, Jesus created a whole new vision of what it means to be a human being. This was a revolutionary idea that the least of these human creatures were to be treasured, were of immense worth. And the early church took up this notion, and they believed that Jesus was actually present in those who otherwise were normally despised for their suffering. For example, in the early church, a diagnosis of leprosy in those early days meant isolation, uncleanness, and death for somebody. But a follower of Jesus named Basil had an idea. What if we were to build a place to love and care for lepers? And they didn't even have to pay for it. We'll raise the money ourselves. One of the most famous sermons in that century was by Basil's brother Gregory of Nyssa, and it was to raise money for this place to take care of lepers. This is what Gregory said. Lepers have been made in the image of God. Again, in the ancient world, this is a strange idea. Gregory said, in the same way that you and I have. And perhaps they preserve the image of God even better than we do. So, let us take care of Christ, that is, lepers who bear His image. Let us take care of Christ while there is still time. Let us minister to Christ's needs. Let us give Christ nourishment. Let us clothe Christ. Let us gather Christ in. Let us show Christ honor. This was a revolution. This was the beginning of what would become known to the world as hospitals. And the Council of Nyssa, by the way, the same council that affirmed what would become known as the Nicene Creed, also ruled that wherever a cathedral existed, there must be a hospice, a place of caring for the sick and the poor. That's why even in our day, hospitals often have names like Good Samaritan or Good Shepherd or St. Anthony's. They were among the world's first voluntary charitable institutions. Another follower of Jesus named Henry Durant couldn't stand the sound of soldiers crying on a battlefield after they'd been wounded. So he said he would devote his life to helping them in Jesus' name. And that was the beginning of an organization that became known as the Red Cross. Every time you see the Red Cross, you see a little thumbprint of Jesus. Or there was a Lutheran pastor named Theodore Fleidner, and he trained a group of mostly peasant women to nurse the sick. And this led to a movement of hospitals all over Europe. And this inspired a young woman by the name of Florence Nightingale to give her life to care for the sick. And when she died, she asked her grave to be marked simply with a cross and her initials. She wanted to serve with no acclaim. Compassion became the brand of this new Jesus movement, not because it attracted such wonderful people, but because they understood from their founder that compassion was not optional. This is not to say that there would be no expressions of compassion in the world without Christianity. And of course, Christians often fall terribly short. In Jesus' story, known as the Good Samaritan, it is the least religiously orthodox person who shows the greatest compassion. Few people show less compassion than those who try to argue that Christians have a corner on compassion. But a philosopher named Mark Nelson puts it like this: if you ask what is Jesus' influence on medicine and compassion, I would suggest that wherever you have an institution of self-giving for the lonely and for practical welfare of the lonely, schools, hospitals, hospices, orphanages for those who will never be able to repay, this probably has its roots in the movement of Jesus. Jesus continuously created a revolution of humanity. We've seen how he valued children, and we've seen how every human being has worth, no matter their condition or status. But another radical change was how Jesus viewed women. The longest conversation recorded between Jesus and another person is in the Gospel of John, chapter 4. Jesus sits to rest by a well, tired as he was from his journey. It is striking how casually the Gospel writers note Jesus' limitations. He gets tired from walking. And a Samaritan woman comes by for water. Jesus asks her for a drink. When the disciples come back, they're surprised to find him talking with a woman. At one point, Jesus says to this woman, she has 5 husbands and is now living with a man to whom she's not married. Len Koek notes, there's a long line of interpreters who assume this means that she is sexually immoral or unfaithful. But in reality, divorces were quite rare in Jesus' day, and we don't know how many of her marriages ended up in divorce or how many ended by death. And there are, as far as we know, no records of a woman being the one to initiate divorce. In other words, this is a woman who had been rejected over and over. And her current arrangement is probably not about her casual sexuality. In that world, if a man wanted a woman of lower class, he could bring her into his existing marriage as a concubine or a second wife. This is very possibly her only means of survival. Interestingly, the woman's marital history is more intriguing to commentators than it is to Jesus. While his culture and ours so often identify women in terms of shame, body shame, character shame, sexual shame, Jesus does not begin by identifying her shame. Now, in modern day telling of this story, it's often assumed she was a scandalized woman, a social outcast among her people. But the text makes it clear that people in her community actually listened to her. It says, many of the Samaritans from that town believed in Jesus because of the woman's testimony. This rabbi sits at a well and engages in a deep, theological, personal discussion about her relationship with God. He takes seriously her mind and her opinions and her questions. In doing so, Jesus is saying, I know you. I know you're a woman, a Samaritan. Your life is very hard. I know your story. I care about you. Is it any wonder she could not stop talking about this man? Jesus did something very subversive. He was treating a woman like somebody who had her own identity. Men in Jesus' day had this tendency to define women's identities in terms of the men in their life. Kind of an odd thing for a man to do, hard to imagine. There's an old story where a CEO and his wife are traveling and they stop to get gas. And the CEO goes inside, and when he comes out, he notices his wife is talking to the service station attendant. He asks her why. It turns out she knows the attendant and she used to date him. Feeling kind of smug, he says, "I'll bet you're thinking you're glad you married me, a CEO, and not a service station attendant." And she says, "No, I was thinking if I'd married him, he'd be a CEO and you'd be a service station attendant." And the problem with that story is, how come she can't be the CEO? Better yet, how come she can't work with freedom and joy and love with dignity and honor instead of finding identity either in a husband or a job title? And with Jesus, this becomes possible. Jesus offers women a new community. Jesus says that the highest calling of a woman is also the highest calling of a man. The glorious adventure of coming to know and do the will of the God in whose image they are created. And through Jesus, this calling now becomes available to any woman, regardless of her age or marital status or childbearing capacity. In the Gospels, it was women who followed Jesus to the cross when all the men were afraid and ran away. And this was noted. The early church father, John Chrysostom, wrote that here is where womanhood most shows its courage. When the disciples had fled, these women were present. In all four Gospels, the task of being witnesses who proclaim the resurrection is given to women. Now, this is remarkable because, again, in the ancient world, women's testimony was generally disregarded because they were of such low status. When a Greek philosopher, a guy named Celsus, wanted to argue that there are not good reasons for believing Jesus was resurrected, he noted, "But who saw the resurrection? A hysterical female, as you say. And perhaps some one other of those were deluded by this same sorcery." We see a little of this dynamic in Luke. When they came back from the tomb, the women told these things to the 11 and to all the others, but they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense, Luke writes. Can you imagine the frustration of the woman? And then Jesus appears to the disciples. I would love to have been there the next time that the disciples and the women come together. And the women say something like, "Christ is risen. Told you so." You know, the subversive value of women meant they began to take on unusually prominent roles of leadership in the early church. The Apostle Paul refers to several households that form the infrastructure of the early church, and over half of them are headed by women. Women begin to find value in this new community, and they devoted their lives to it. Jesus is why women have traveled continents, spent decades learning a strange language so that they could translate the gospel, planted churches, cared for the sick, educated the illiterate, marched for the oppressed. Is it possible that our world has still not caught up to Jesus when it comes to how we think about women? There was a revolution in the dignity of the individual that was going on in the world, and it was sparked by Jesus. And we kind of take it for granted because we live in the world that resulted through this. But a great writer, Yale philosopher named Nicholas Walterstorff, writes about how our notions about justice are built on a fundamental assumption of the dignity and worth of every human being. And the foundation for that is the belief that all people, men and women, are made in the image of God. And that is the idea safeguarded by Israel, released to the world by Jesus. And now you and I are an heir of that. So let's get personal here. There'll be people in your little world who get stepped on, who get trashed on a regular basis. Somebody who, because of the way that they look, because of what they have or they don't have, because of their low status, is just disregarded. I wonder who God might be calling you to notice and remember. You know, folks in churches do this kind of thing. They go into an area where children don't have a shot of education and adopt a classroom. They go to a facility where elderly people are living unloved, unlistened to, and they care. They go to some part of the world where folks are under-resourced, where they have no food, and they help them to have enough to eat. I wonder where God might be calling you to lift up somebody that's forgotten. When you do this, you celebrate an idea that Jesus brought to the world, that every human being is loved and made in the image of God.